Okay, great. If you notice when I'm talking that there's more people coming into the waiting room, feel free to admit them. I'll try to catch them as they're coming in as well. But okay, here we go. Try to catch them as they're coming in as well. But okay, here we go. Welcome everyone. Happy Tuesday. Hope you're all well. I'll just give 30 seconds or so for people to connect to the audio. 30 seconds or so for people to connect to the audio. 30 seconds or so for people. Great stuff. Really happy to see you all here today for your Tuesday lunchtime. Thank you for joining us. My name is Shay Butler and I'm Program Manager at Tangent, which is Trinity's Ideas Workspace. Another way for saying that is that we're one of the innovation departments within Trinity, and we specialize in training and support in creativity, innovation, and entrepreneurship. And that covers, different cohorts, undergrads, postgrads, direct to industry. And today at this roundtable, which is entitled Embedding Meaningful Wellbeing Practices at Work, we're kind of talking about well-being from the professional industry side of things, and it's in a way a little sneaky promotion of a workplace wellbeing program that's starting in May. I'll tell you a little bit more about that program at the end of the session. But what I will do now is just mention some housekeeping related to the session. We are live streaming this session on social. We will not be post sharing any content that includes you. Let's say you contribute verbally without asking you in advance. So, but just to let you know, we are live streaming. When it comes to communicating with myself and the panel during the session, we'd love for you to do that via chat. And just to check to make sure that you all know where chat is, feel free now to pop into chat, and you can, what do we do? You can pop in out of 1 to 10 how your well-being is at this very moment, with 10 being gold star, you've just won the Olympics, and 1 being not very good. So feel free to pop into chat and we'll kind of get an idea of where people are at. Okay, thanks. So we've got 7s, 8s, 6s. Great. It's all looking pretty high at the moment. I'm probably at a 6, to be honest. I'm a bit tired after Paddy's weekend, but it'll come around. So thanks. It seems like you know where the chat is. During the session, feel free to pop any questions or comments into chat, and I will do my best to bring them to the panel and represent them for you. And then at the very end, for the last 10 minutes or so, we will have a little promo piece for the program that's related to this panel discussion, and also we'll have time for Q&A. We are going to try to finish 5 minutes before 2 because I know people probably have other sessions. So that's it for the intro, but there is one more little piece of work I'd like you to do. Similar to the exercise we did on chat out of 1 to 10, I'm just going to pop up a poll just to get an impression of the group and everyone that's on today, how they feel their organization does when it comes to establishing meaningful well-being practices at work. So I'm going to launch a poll and it should come up. So feel free to submit your answers to that. There's some coming through already. Thank you very much. So my organization gets it right. We have well-established and meaningful well-being practices at work. So I'll just give it another little bit more time for some others to interact with that. The results are looking pretty positive at the moment. We got no nevers. So I think we've got a good representation there. So I'll end the poll, share results. So you should be seeing them now. So it looks like, almost 70% of people feel like their organization sometimes gets it right. We've got a very happy 14% who say that their organization always gets it right. And we've about the same number of people who say rarely. So again, that's interesting to see. And maybe the panel will have some thoughts on that when we introduce them. So that's where I'm going to go next. So in no particular order, first up, I will introduce Brian Crook. So Brian is one of the facilitators on our Workplace Wellbeing Masterclass program, and indeed he's a facilitator on our postgraduate cert in Workplace Wellbeing as well. And Brian is the founder of Workplace Wellbeing Ireland. Brian, how are you today?
I'm great, Shay. Thanks for the introduction. How are you?
I'm good. Like I said, I'm a 6. Where are you out of 10, Brian?
I put down an 8. Yeah, still feeling a little sluggish after the weekend, I have to say, but yeah, I'm getting back there.
Okay, great. Okay, nice to have you, Brian. Thank you. Next up, I will introduce Dr. Adele Grazzi, and Adele again is a facilitator on our Workplace Wellbeing Masterclass program. Adele is also assistant professor in the Center of Innovative Human Studies, and that's at TCD School of Psychology. How are you doing, Adele? Professor in the Center of Innovative Human Studies. Oh, mute. TCD School
Usual. Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm very good. Shay and Brian, how are you guys?
Mute. We're good. Yeah. Great. So we'll move on. Last but not least, we have Tony Vickers-Byrne. I'll just add your camera up, Tony. Tony is a chartered fellow of CPD with 30 years experience at HR director and board advisor level. And Tony has recently relocated to Ireland. So Tony, how are you today?
I'm good. I say the most important thing I've done for my health since moving to Ireland last February is I've got 3 allotments up in Howth, and that kind of really does keep me sane, gives me a structure since I retired. But I've also got digger's elbow, if that exists now. So I'll probably give it about an 8 out of 10. But I'm happy about the allotments. The digger's elbow is just an occupational hazard.
Nice.
Would you take a point or two off for the rugby at the weekend as well, Tony?
At about 6 o'clock on Saturday, I was free.
Nice. Okay, thanks, Tony, and thanks to the rest of the panel. So we're going to kick off with the panel discussion itself. So we're going to run through kind of 3 main topics or areas, and for each of those areas, I'll be posing a leading question, and we'll go to the panel, and they will give us their thoughts on that. And again, just to reiterate, if you have any thoughts or any questions that you'd like to ask on top of that, please pop them into the chat, and I will find them. So just to remind ourselves, the title of this roundtable is Embedding and Meaningful Wellbeing Practices at Work. And for each of the topics that we're going through, we're going to kind of talk about individual aspects of that title. So the first aspect of that title that we're going to talk about is what do we mean? We're going to start like early, and we're going to figure out what do we mean by wellbeing practices at work, just to really make sure that we're all on the same page. So Brian, I might start with you on that one. So for you, what do we mean when we say wellbeing practices at work?
So well-being practices, what's workplace well-being? It's for me, it's any workplace health promotion activity or organizational policy that's designed to support healthy behavior in the workplace and to improve health outcomes. And I think you had the word meaningful in there as well. So that's I guess where it's kind of an important point to make. Well, what does meaningful mean? I mean, my meaningful might be different to your meaningful. And I think the poll was interesting. You ran at the start there. I think there was a small enough percentage, but a decent enough percentage that had they said workplace always delivered on wellbeing programs. So I'd love to talk to them because I didn't know that existed, to be honest with you. But I suppose what the research shows us what a meaningful wellbeing program is that it has strong senior and middle management support, but it will also have those grassroots champions in there. It will have employee input when you're developing programs and objectives. We'll have dedicated staff. We'll have a strong communication strategy consistent with the corporate culture. And there'll be regular evaluations. So they'll have some kind of well-defined metrics in there as well, supporting this work. And there'll be regular evaluations.
Nice, great. Yeah, and like you highlighted, the word meaningful is probably the crux of the question really. But Brian, is there any particular aspects of workplace well-being that you find are becoming more and more important in recent times? Let's say since COVID.
I suppose there's a lot of companies that have been interested in this for a while. A lot of really well-intentioned leaders, a lot of really well-intentioned organizations. Where I'm seeing the shift is maybe a shift from random acts of wellness, so just a nice-to-have initiative here and there, to making well-being that bit more of a strategic priority in the workplace. And that takes time. It's a much more of a longer-term investment than a short-term gain. But companies are investing in that. They're investing in education for their leaders, for well-being leaders. They're creating roles. They're supporting programs with budget and resources, and people's time is being allocated for this as well. So that's where I see the change in the kind of the structural change, but the important strategic change as well.
Nice, thanks, Brian. And Tony, might go to you next just to see if you have any build on that. I know you've worked, for 30 years in HR and in the CIPD as well. So when it comes, Brian mentioned new roles in well-being. So like, what's your thoughts on how that's developing and the new opportunities for people out there when it comes to roles and well-being?
I mean, I think it's great that the emphasis is now so much that it's a core responsibility. I mean, before I was at the CIPD, I was HR Director of Public Health England, and we were in a really great position that we were kind of like testing out new programs, new apps that were coming through, typically from across the Atlantic, but we had the opportunity to test them with our staff, and our managers were well-being managers. So, if they can't implement it, then, God forbid. But what we did find is that, as Brian mentioned, just this importance of it being a multifaceted approach. I remember when I was a HR director in the NHS back in the early 90s, and my new chief executive described me as a HR director to be a policeman. And my job was to actually ensure that staff followed the rules. And I left the organisation shortly afterwards. I just didn't want to work in that sort of organisation. And the worst possible thing that an employer can do is to say, here's the health and well-being rules. It's different for, obviously, for health and safety, where you've got legal responsibility, and clearly people then do need to follow the rules. But for general well-being, if you try and impose rules, you're never going to get it off the ground. And this morning I was preparing the papers for the AGM of the owner management company where we live, 9 apartments. And I'm recommending that we get rid of the rules which were produced in 1999 and which caused huge amount of consternation, which caused disagreement, which caused confusion, which caused residents to fall out with each other, and just rely on the leases and a short behavioural code, which talks about being considerate, being kind, being civil, being understanding. If you disagree, don't be disagreeable. Add that with the leases, and we can bin those rules in the recycling bin. If you disagree, don't be disagreeable.
Nice, yeah. Mentioning just your example there of making sure that people follow rules like a policeman. That's pretty extreme. On the flip side, Tony, was there just in your experience, was there any example that sticks in your mind, like any good positive example that sticks in your mind in terms of something that came along that a new tool or a new approach that you were testing?
It was always when the staff said, we think this works and it will work for this particular area. And Brian again mentioned the issue about sort of working groups and staff groups and so on, and particularly for those people from a vulnerable background, those people who need additional support to get that level playing field. It's really important that their voice is heard and that the well-being initiatives that are on offer, meet their needs, because I can't know what the needs are of somebody who I don't share their experiences or don't share their health or don't share their background. It's up to them to actually have that voice, and for the organisation to give them that voice and listen to it and act on it.
Great. Thanks, Tony. Adele, will come to you next, maybe since you're kind of representing the most academic perspective. I wonder, academically, when we talk about workplace meaningful well-being practices at work, what comes up? What's the easiest way to explain that to a bunch of students that come in and they're not sure what workplace well-being is?
I suppose I always give the examples to my students where we say that organizations sometimes might try to tick boxes of well-being. So you might have organizations that might have a gym or might have healthy food or might offer, a meditation room. But all this is not really going to work out if you are the person that goes to the meditation room and everybody else in the workforce thinks that you're lazy because you're going to the meditation room. So it's really about changing those organizational norms within the culture to create a more meaningful well-being culture within the organization. So it's kind of changing the way well-being is viewed, rather than trying to tick those boxes. So really caring and being compassionate about your workforce.
Great. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I suppose, just to summarize a little bit, Tony mentioned staff voice, and we're talking about setting norms. So maybe this is just an open question to anyone on the panel. How do we start to capture that staff voice or the voice of people within our organization in a kind of a safe and transparent way to see what they need? Brian, I might actually go to you on that one first.
What I've seen work really well to capture the voice, to capture the needs and wants of colleagues from a well-being perspective is when organizations create a shared ownership for well-being. So quite often there's a perception that if well-being is coming from, if it's like just a program that's coming from one person or one team in a silo, quite often HR, it's seen as it's just another HR initiative or just another management initiative. However, if you can create a shared ownership for well-being in the organization, I mean, that can really change things. And the best examples I've seen of that is when companies create a network across the organization of, you can call them well-being champions, well-being steering committee, well-being ambassadors, advocates. The name isn't important, but it's a network where each, is it department, is it location, is it role type, is it kind of different background, is it maybe some of the employee resource groups are represented, but there's voices, the diverse voices within the organization are represented in this group, and they're not only just inputting into the wellbeing program, they're actually helping to create it and define it, update it, improve it. So it's a living, breathing group that meets regularly, that works with the well-being leader as opposed to, for the well-being leader to create that over time, because it will take time, that cultural change in the organization.
And I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit here. So people are busy in work, and they've got their day to day to do, and they've got their stresses outside of work. So I suppose when it comes to developing that shared ownership, I guess it has to be an opt-in, so we're not forcing people to join these things. So are we hoping that there's a certain number of people that are like intrinsically motivated to contribute to this, which I suppose in most organizations there probably would be?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, people should volunteer for this. In fact, it won't work if people are forced into it, or it's the same people that are just being nominated from each team for these kind of positions. People have to volunteer for it. You don't need to be marathon runners. You don't need to be super fit and healthy. It's just you're interested in leading by example yourself from a health and well-being perspective. You're not going to be an expert in health and well-being. You're just going to lead by example. You're going to work on the communication. You're going to input into the program. You're going to be a two-way communication hub, if you like, feeding up to the management, to the well-being leader, what's working, what people are looking for, and then feeding back as well, going, look, here's why we're not going to do this, here's why we are doing this. So absolutely, people should volunteer, and they should over time you can build up this intrinsic motivation. I think most of the teams I've seen grow they've started organically. They've definitely started, it's been kind of side a desk, an hour here and there when it's been available. But over time, as that team has demonstrated the benefit of that team to the organization, there are different ways to reward and recognize that the time that people are putting into that champion team. It might be formal recognition, it might be informal. Some organizations will kind of earmark dedicated time. Maybe 10% of a colleague's time is dedicated to this role over time, but that doesn't happen in the beginning. It takes time to build it up and to demonstrate the benefits of this team.
Great. Thanks, Brian. Just have a comment in the chat from Janet, and I think, Janet, this was related to Brian's thought about random acts of wellness. So talking about a well-being week as if a week will fix all the well-being challenges. Yeah, I heard something over Mother's Day about, it shouldn't be just one day, so every day should be a special day for your mother, and I guess every day should be a special day for well-being in your organization as well. But what we might do is move on to the next topic now. So we kind of talked there about introducing workplace well-being practices at work and what that meant. Now I kind of want to focus a little bit about what that means this year. So we know that things have changed a lot. So in 2023, what do we think is coming up as the most important or the most meaningful or the biggest issues when it comes to well-being this year? So Adele, I might start with you on that one, if that's okay.
Yeah. I think, like, to answer that question, it's important to take just for a minute a bit of a step back and understand what, work was conceptualized before the pandemic, and also what well-being meant before the pandemic. So, in the last 100 of years, even though legislation and employees' rights have changed, obviously, the concept of work was very similar. So we all went into a building where we worked our hours, whatever our hours were, maybe from 9 to 5, and then we left that building, went home, and that was that. And our leaders were within that building, and they could kind of supervise us, and they kind of knew what we were doing, if we were in work or we weren't. And then the pandemic hit, and before the pandemic, well-being was also kind of being researched. So, things like stress and burnout, we were looking at that academically, but it was also always kind of related to performance, just to employees' performance. And also, obviously, concepts like health and safety were becoming more and more relevant. But then when the pandemic hit, we have seen a big change in how we view work, but also how we view well-being. So what happened there was that, first of all, obviously people that were working in healthcare, they were under obviously loads of stress, and they had to work really long shifts. And, it became central to understand how to maintain the well-being, especially the mental health well-being of these individuals. Because obviously, they needed that workforce to be working. And at the same time, we had a lot of people were moving into remote work. So again, there was a shift in, okay, so what's happening with this group of people, and how are we maintaining their mental health as well? So some people love to work remotely, but a lot of other people weren't happy at all and were feeling really isolated and so on. So it's no surprise that today, when we think about well-being and the pillars of well-being, and probably there's like 4 or 5 workplace pillars, which is mental well-being, financial well-being, physical well-being, social connections, occupational well-being. Really, the two strongest ones that are coming forth in research are mental health well-being, but also socialization. So how do we create those interactions? But on top of that, we need to also think that the way we understand work has also changed. So we are transitioning from remote working, the people that were working remotely, into hybrid work. So with hybrid, we mean people that, work some hours in the office and some hours at home. But also we are dealing with a gig economy, which is kind of something that is happening more and more recently. So people that have part-time jobs, or organizations that use external contractors, or people that have temporary contracts. And then on top of that, we also have cross-border workers. So people that might be working for an organization in Ireland, but are living somewhere else in Europe. So this is kind of a completely different context of work. We don't really, and research-wise, we still don't know, the impacts this is having. So when we talk about generally, how do we maintain an organization, the culture within an organization healthy? How do we create those norms? For example, Shay, going back to what you said, how do we get people to speak up, for example? So we need to create, for example, a culture of psychological safety, which means that people will feel free to be able to speak up and safe to speak up. Now, psychological safety doesn't mean that everything you say is going to be good and nice. It also means that you are open to conflicts, that your organization is open to conflict, and they're open to, exchange of opinions and ideas. And then also other concepts, and norms such as, justice within the organization, people feeling that what is happening within the organization is fair, having an organizational identity, open communication channels, and so on. So we kind of knew this even before the pandemic, but I think what is becoming central right now is leadership. Because leaders need to learn how to manage these groups of people working both hybrid. So they're working, so you might have meetings where some people are within the office and some people are online in a computer. So a lot of the time, you know, when I'm talking to different organizations, they kind of, the feedback is that the people that are online feel that they are kind of the out group, that they're not included within the team meeting. So again, how do we need to give leaders the tools to manage this new workforce and this new concept of workforce that we have. And generally, we are putting a lot of emphasis in creating a new leadership style, which was always there as well, but is becoming more and more important, which is empathetic leadership. So we are looking at leaders that are compassionate, that have empathy, that create a sense of purpose for their staff and a sense of community. So yeah, so I suppose when we're talking about what is meaningful for well-being in 2023, it's about creating that compassionate leadership. Unfortunately, these leaders are still do not have the tools, because it's only like 2-3 years that this concept of how we work has changed. So we need to give them the tools of how to manage this new staff. And also it's creating, you know, more awareness around mental health issues, and also more awareness on how we are going to connect people, individuals, and employees, so that they don't feel isolated or left out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really interesting to think of those different groups and what work is for them. You know, what reality work is for them, whether you're working from home constantly or hybrid. I think, you know, it's really easy just to think to recognize or empathize with the group that you're in, or the situation that you're in that works for you. So Brian, anything else to build on that? Adele gave us a lot of great stuff there, talking about compassionate and empathetic leadership to help support like well-being initiatives going forward.
Absolutely, yeah, and I'd echo everything Adele said. And we were actually just talking about this last night on the postgrad in workplace wellness in class. We see like part of our role as well-being leaders in 2023 and probably beyond really is to educate our leaders and to educate our middle management as well on what is required, what their role is, because I think we've spoken about the tick boxing exercises that we see, but I think the reality is these leaders and organizations don't even know they're engaged in that. So we need to educate them on what a strategic and sustainable well-being program looks like, what their role in that is. And it's not just, we don't just need you to write a check every now and then. We need you being active. We need your visible advocacy. We need your involvement, your engagement. We need you communicating in everything that you do, that well-being is important. We need you leading by example and modeling healthy behaviors yourself, whatever that is for you. It might just be having lunch with your team. It might just be taking that downtime in the evening, switching off your laptop, not sending emails, you know, in the middle of the night or at weekends. It could be as simple as that. Those healthy behaviors and modeling those, and again, that's over time. It's going to build up to lead to that, those organizational norms and that culture of health that Adele was talking about.
Great. Thanks everyone for your comments in chat. I'm just going to read out a couple that kind of tie in with what Adele was chatting about. Yeah, leadership is central to improving meaningful relational connections in work. And then comment from Philip around the benefits of having good leadership, and potentially biggest problem being pure communication from leaders or managers to staff, and maybe even a distrust of managers. An interesting question came in a little bit earlier from Maria, who in her experience feels that sometimes initiatives in well-being can be seen as through a cynical lens, because colleagues are are expected to keep the show on the road. They're working long hours. They're kind of constantly primed to produce. So any thoughts, and maybe Tony, I'll go to you on this one. Any thoughts on how to, in that situation where staff are constantly at the limit, how do we make a well-being initiative seem meaningful and well-intentioned, given that maybe the underlying work circumstances are unlikely to change?
Yeah, I mean the role modelling is key here, and I mean just following on from what Adela was saying about the it's only been 2 or 3 years where this has been really a top headline, but I think 2 or 3 years is quite a long time considering what we've been through, as employers, as a community, as a world, or whatever. We've had to make quick decisions, and I don't think that it's reasonable for managers to be able to say, well, I didn't really realize this was an important part of my role. If some of them behaved the way they do in work at home, their families wouldn't put up with that. And it's this, some of the other comments that were coming through about, well, that work and real life, are totally and utterly interchangeable and increasingly indivisible. I think that the expectations that you have in your family life, dealing with your friends, in your societies, are equally as important as the relationships at work, and vice versa. You need to actually ensure that people who are managers really understand and take responsibility for it, because in the world of social media as well, they know what needs to be done. They know the impact of bad behavior. They see what can happen when leaders take wrong decisions or selfish decisions. They can see the real impact of that. So I do think that when I speak to people who are working now compared to, say, 2 or 3 years ago when I retired, that managers do seem to get it, that if there are any dinosaurs out there, they're quickly exposed by social media, and increasingly by their senior directors, who realize that productivity is absolutely fundamentally based on the health of their organizations. So I'm optimistic about this, but that we do need to ensure that it's everybody in the organization who takes this seriously and say there are no more excuses.
Nice, thanks, Tony. We might move on to the last topic, which we've kind of started to touch on a little bit already. So we have an understanding of what well-being practices are. We know it's complicated. We know the landscape has changed a lot in the last number of years. We've got different working cohorts and different situations. The role of leadership has changed. There's training required there. So it all seems like a little bit complex. And where might we start? So I guess my question is, where might we start? Like, Tony, I might go back to you again on this. What's the starting point here? There's a lot to think about.
Yeah, I mean, everybody says you start with the vision statement. Well, that assumes that the people at the top of the organization understand what needs to be done, and that vision statement will resonate with people. And you see vision statements coming through saying, we are going to have happy staff, we are going to have healthy staff, we're going to have productive staff. Now, if you're an employer who recruits from well-educated, affluent background people, then it's much more likely they're going to be healthy, and it's much more likely that they're going to have some sort of a balance in their life which makes them happier. If you're an employer who's recruiting from people on the breadline, people who may be socially disadvantaged, people who may have to have 2 jobs, people who are carers because they can't afford the carer support, then it's going to be much more difficult for you to have happy staff. And when was I really happy? I was really happy at university. I was really happy at school. I was really happy. I'm really happy now when I'm on my allotment. But that's me. That's my responsibility. I think it's the key responsibility for an employer not to interfere with that potential happiness. To actually, be fair, be reasonable, be consistent, be supportive, be helpful, And where necessary, to educate the employees about what's available and how they can be happier. I was in London over the weekend and talking to a really good friend of mine who's got type 2 diabetes, and it's due to his weight. And his doctor tells him all the time, you've got to lose some weight. And his brother's lost 7 stone out of 23 stone. And this guy needs to lose about 5 stone. And he knows that. He knows that responsibility, but he can't take that step to do it. And, I can't tell him how he can make himself healthy and happy. He knows already. But there are some people who, just because of the pressures of life, would really welcome just having that sort of chat with an expert, or ideally with their manager, as to how they can get healthier and therefore get happier and therefore get more productive. I mean, I learned something today when I was, researching for this chat. And, I still read McKinsey every week when it comes through, and it's great stuff. And it's, a huge mix of articles about the whole range of people practice. McKinsey on point. And I learned today that if you have high temperature saunas, it decreases the risk of all morbidity by 40%. And it decreases the risk of dementia by 66%. So regular use of high temperature saunas decreases the risk of all case mortality by 40% and the risk of dementia by 66%. So tomorrow I'm going to go to Malahide and I'm going to go to the sauna.
That sounds good.
But I didn't know that. I just thought it was something that relaxed you. And actually, well, hold on, if it relaxes you,
that sounds good.
That probably means it's good for you. I didn't know. And it's just having that sort of, little light bulb moments, just to say, well, actually, have you tried this? Have you tried that? And the friend I was talking about, his brother has lost so much weight because he doesn't eat anything which grows underground. Apparently, there's a new diet there that clearly has worked for him. So he will eat cauliflower, but he won't eat potatoes. and all of this sort of stuff that you think, well, that just sounds a bit daft. Some of it may work for you, and just have that opportunity to work in an environment where quirky things can be discussed, where people can actually, come up with ideas which aren't going to be just laughed out of the case. If somebody says this really is going to work for me, this just by doing this little thing is going to make me really happy. And if a manager then says, well, we've got more important things, in my experience, that won't work. Then immediately that person's going to shut up. I remember one of the happiest employers and most productive employers in the UK about 5 years ago was a small train line who had taken away free teas and coffees from their staff. And the new HR person came in and reinstated it. And the staff were really happy. And they voted this HR director as HR Director of the Year because he had taken the radical step of reintroducing free coffee and tea. And they felt that they had been listened to. They felt that they could escape, go and have a cup of coffee and escape the abuse they were getting on the platforms from people whose trains had been delayed or cancelled. So it's all that very, very simple stuff. And, the comment about life and work being indistinguishable. I hope I can get sort of knowledge and keep up to date by looking at McKinsey, by getting involved in things like this, by going up to the allotment and speaking to the huge numbers of mental health professionals who have allotments of things like this, and retired HR people who go up there to chill, who go up there to look over the sea and to perhaps just eat stuff that grows above ground. And just to allow people to be themselves as much as possible, in the same way you'd allow people and you'd want people to be yourselves at home. Because school was supposed to be the happiest time of your life. And then, as I said, when I went to uni, I had the happiest time. Because as you look forward, it's a bit scary. Again, I was looking through McKinsey, just some of the stats. And children today can expect to live 20 years longer than grandparents born in the 1960s. So Annabelle and Shay hopefully will live at least 20 years longer than me. But how are they going to cope with that final 20 years? Because at the moment, 2/3 of people over 70, two-thirds of people over 60, have cognitive impairment. 70% of people currently alive will spend an average of 3 years in long-term care. People without a strong life purpose are more than twice as likely to die from cardiovascular disease. People who are lonely have worse health outcomes, morbidity and mortality across the board. So how are these people who are going to be living longer going to be kept happier and healthier? And it's the responsibility of employers to try and make their period when they're working with them for 30, 40, perhaps 50 years into the future as decent as possible. Because as you get older, the body breaks down, and you just want to keep that as far as possible in the future by doing this stuff and by being encouraged to do the stuff like exercise and diet. But most importantly, to have that support from a community and the support from an employer, which actually makes you feel good about yourself, and that you've got a voice and that you've got a purpose. And then you'll make the right decisions about your health, not only in work, but also out of work and with your family, and also giving advice to your friends as well.
There's thanks for that, Tony. We talked earlier about psychological safety, and then you mentioned the importance of having almost like a informal someone to chat to in work to give you that idea of have you tried this or have you tried that. It's again going back to how do we get started, Brian, when it comes to starting that culture and that norm and the mindset shift towards a psychological safe place where people feel they can be vulnerable, where do you see that starting? You mentioned before shared ownership and kind of building a community. Would that be part of that?
Absolutely, yeah. Actually, as part of the training for, let's say, Wellbeing champions, Wellbeing ambassadors, we emphasize very clearly it's not, you're not going to be an expert in health and well-being, but you can learn. There's a lot of the tools that Tony was talking about there, like how do you look after number one? What does well-being mean to you? And we do use it. We have one tool we use, which can be beneficial, which I'm sure some people on the call will be familiar with, the 5 ways to well-being. Using those kind of evidence-based tools to connect, to be active, to give, to keep learning, and to take notice. Those simple tools, they're the equivalent of your 5 fruit and veg a day, if you like, from a well-being perspective. I mean, that's how you can lead by example for yourself, for your family, for your teams, for the people around you, for your community settings as well. So it can be as simple as that. It's stuff like Tony was talking about, taking notice at the allotment. An interesting, you asked the happiness question came up. I heard a psychologist on the radio the other day talking about, somebody asked him, the interviewer asked him, how do you make yourself happy? Which I thought was quite a difficult question. But he answered straight away and said, it's easy, you make somebody else happy. So the idea of the give for the 5 ways to well-being. Of course, the be active piece we all know about, the importance of being active, but whatever that means to you. It doesn't necessarily mean those marathons. It could be simply your gardening piece, which is moderate physical activity, and then connection. Adelia has spoken about this, the importance of that connection, your relationships at home, at work, with your manager. That is something that can be identified as, if your relationship is poor with your manager, with your supervisor, I mean, that can be a psychosocial hazard in the workplace. So just understanding all of that, bringing your full self to work, doing your bit across the 5 ways to well-being, that's how you can start to lay the foundations. You just start with number 1, and just don't underestimate the power of the kind of the peer influence you can have and the people directly around you, and then over time, if they're adopting those behaviors as well, that's how it spreads.
Great.
directly around
Maybe
you,
we'll. I'm
time
just
share
looking
and
at the time.
document
Maybe
behaviors
we'll
as well.
we'll
That's
close on that very positive note. That we all have the power to make a difference. I am going to transition a little bit to just talk about the related workplace wellbeing program that both Adele and Brian are facilitators on. I'm going to share my screen, so you should see a PowerPoint coming